But I wanted to test this gun in all 4 positions of the hammer. So at rest, quarter cock, half cock, and fully cocked. And essentially, as a result of that testing, there were only 2 times that I was able to get this firearm to fire. The first one being when the hammer was at rest on a loaded chamber. So as I previously described to you, the firing pin was sitting directly on the primer. So when I struck the hammer with a mallet, that provided enough force to detonate the primer. So again, that's a known feature of this type of firearm. The second test where this occurred was when the hammer was in the fully cocked position, and I was doing my striking in the 6 planes as I described. And eventually I got to the rear of the firearm, so that back plane. And eventually at some point I struck the hammer with a rawhide mallet, and the hammer actually fell and it detonated the primer. So what happened was some of the internal components.
Turn off your cell phone, whoever.
Broke to allow that hammer to fall and fire the primed cartridge case. So I previously mentioned those quarter and half cock notches. If the hammer were to fall and there was no damage inside the gun, I would expect that the portion that makes contact with the hammer is called the sear. That sear should have been caught either by the quarter or the half cock notch as the hammer was falling. It should not have been able to fall all the way. So this is what led me to believe that there was some type of damage that occurred within the gun. And eventually I disassembled it to figure out exactly what that damage was.
So the damage that you discovered, just so we're clear, was that damage sustained at the FBI lab?
Yes, it was.
Based on the testing that you did, when this gun was received by the FBI, was it in proper working order?
Yes, so the first exam I did was the function exam. So again, that's making sure it's operating correctly and that it hasn't been modified. During that test, I also examined the safeties. So as it was received in that condition, when I went through the function evaluation, everything appeared to be operating correctly. So it's
very important that he said functioning and not modified, because Alec Baldwin was suggesting it may have been modified.
Resting position, correct?
That's very important.
Correct.
And then did you put it in the quarter cock position?
Yes.
And did you strike it with a mallet?
In that particular case, for the quarter as well as the half cock, I did not need to do the mallet testing.
What kind of testing did you do?
So the quarter and half cock notches are not designed to essentially lock the trigger, put your firearm completely in a safe setting. So again, they're designed that if your finger slips off the hammer, it's going to catch it. So in this type of gun, if your hammer is in either the quarter or the half cock, you can actually squeeze the trigger, and if you squeeze it hard enough, it's going to cock the hammer enough that it releases. So you can still make the hammer fall, even though it's in these 2 intermediate safety positions.
Waiting for the hammer to fall.
If you apply sufficient pressure to the trigger.
Queen.
So I did a variety of testing to determine if I put the hammer in the quarter cock as well as the half cock notch, and I squeeze the trigger hard enough that I allow the hammer to fall, is it even feasible for the hammer to detonate the cartridge? And I determined in both of those positions it was not.
And we understand that the next testing that you did was in the full cock position.
That's correct.
And ultimately, as you predicted, was the gun damaged?
As a result of the testing, yes, it was damaged.
Okay. Let's move to
I couldn't resist. Queen was just possessing my body.
Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yes, so this is a photograph that I took after the accidental discharge testing was complete. So on the right-hand side, we have the hammer. As I mentioned before, the firing pin is fixed to the hammer, so that's that piece that you see protruding from the hammer. In the top left, this piece is called the cylinder stop. So you can see a piece of that component fractured off. the bottom left here, we have the trigger. And this tiny piece here is what actually fractured off the trigger. Now, as I mentioned before, I explained the quarter and half cock notches. So I'm actually going to point those out to you. On the hammer, these kind of jagged edges, the first one is the quarter cock notch. So as you're cocking the hammer, you hear that first click. That is the sear portion of the trigger, which is now broken, locking into that little recess. Your second click is the half cock notch. So that's that second jagged edge. And then your last click is the actual sear notch. So that's where the trigger is sitting when the hammer is in its fully cocked position. So when I struck the hammer with the mallet, it actually broke off that piece of the trigger that was sitting up against the hammer there.
And is there anything unusual to you in this photo about the full cock notch on the hammer?
Stop saying that.
So again, this notch here is the full cock notch. So you may notice when looking at this that this notch appears much flatter when you compare it to the other two notches. So it could be that a small portion of this surface was also damaged during the testing. But in addition to that, there are times where the sear notch is just not as pronounced as the other two notches. So I didn't observe any damage myself in this particular area, but it's possible that that area was damaged as well.
And based on your testing, did you form an opinion about whether or not this gun could be fired without the handler pulling the trigger?
So again, the only two times that occurred was with the hammer at rest on a loaded chamber. And the second time,
Just say no, dude. Don't confuse the jury. Say no.
Internal components. So again, if these parts had not broken, I would expect that the trigger should have been caught by either the quarter or the half cock notch as the hammer was coming forward.
In other words,
I would
no.
not expect this to occur had this breakage not happened.